Okay, thank you. On behalf of the Museum in Tasman and Eilean, thank you all very much for coming out today, especially on such a great day. And I'd like to welcome and introduce Blake Milteer. He's the curator of the Mackinnon exhibition at the National Galleries of Scotland. He'll be talking today about how the disruption of 1843 contributed to Scotland becoming world pioneer in the development of photography. This talk has been organised as part of the activities programme which accompanies the touring exhibition of Scotland's photograph album, which Blake curated. The exhibition is on loan to us from National Galleries of Scotland and National Library of Scotland, and it's only with us for another week before it returns to Edinburgh. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I thoroughly recommend it, and our galleries are open today till 5 o'clock if anyone wants to pop down after the talk. This is the second of two talks on the disruption. Earlier in the week, Rev Nigel Anderson explored the events that led to the disruption. If you missed that talk, it's available on our YouTube channel. We're also recording this talk and we'll put it up at the start of next week. The disruption painting by Octavius Hill that Blake will be referring to in his talk is on display at the headquarters of the Free Church of Scotland in Edinburgh. And we're using a digital version of it today with their kind permission. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Blake.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks to Ashley and all the staff here for all their hard work putting on the exhibition and all the related programming while the exhibition's been up and running. Been extremely pleased with the way things have gone here, and in a sense, it's a shame to have to take it back when we are, because we would love to keep it touring around, but you'll see more of the Mackinnon collection to be sure. And I'm happy to talk with you after this about ways in which you engage with the collection in the future. So this talk explores the photographs made by the creative partnership of David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson in the 1840s. Specifically, it looks at the relationship between their photography and Hill's painting commemorating the first General Assembly of the Free Church of Scotland signing the Act of Separation and Deed of Admission, also known as the Disruption Picture. And we'll, at the end, look at the legacy of their photographs in Scotland and to some degree abroad. As Ashley mentioned earlier this week, Rev Nigel Anderson gave a wonderful talk about the social origins and consequences of the disruption. So if you're able to attend, it gives a little bit of context for what we'll be talking about today, specific to the painting and its background. I think you'll find it very useful if you haven't, if you weren't able to attend that, to watch it online, as Ashley suggested. So the disruption, just in short, to give us a bit of background. I'll just keep going until they get through. This was the event that prompted an extraordinary partnership between Hill and Adamson, in which their combined artistic vision and technical expertise resulted in images that were unprecedented in their time. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through, that the photographic images that we're going to be looking at there was no precedent for when they were made, or there was very little direct precedent for, I should say. And these photographs made by Hill and Adamson profoundly influenced later photographers, and I would suggest continue to affect us today. So I want to back up a little bit to the beginning here. When we think of photographs, we think of that being one of the multitude of visual media that we engage with. Some of it routinely, day to day, moment to moment, some of it less frequently. But if we think back to the history of visual representation, us representing ourselves and our world and our vision through images made by ourselves, we think of what? We think of painting, we think of drawing, we think of sculpture, right? Well, how long is the history of those visual media in terms of human history? Well, to give a sense, what was it, just last year, I think, some paintings were discovered in a cave in Indonesia dated at 45,000 years ago. 45,000 years painting has been around, and that's just what we found. That's just what we know. So undoubtedly, we're going to find more.
Sorry. Numbers. Sorry.
Tens of thousands of years. and of course, drawing is related to painting, and you know, we see that you can in fact classify much of that cave painting as drawing rather than painting. Sculpture undoubtedly has been around almost as long. What then about photography? How long has photography been around? Well, I have the painting up here just for reference. We'll come back to it later. Photography has been around for quite a while as well, but certainly not 45,000 years. What is photography? Photo, light, right? It's the manipulation of light, something that we wouldn't interact in the world as we do without. Arguably, we wouldn't be here without. So photography is based upon the action of light. Where did it begin? Well, it began with this apparatus, or our recognition of it in terms of potential usage. Began with this apparatus, and this is called a camera obscura. Okay? And so what you're seeing there might be a bit confusing, but the basic idea is if we turn this room into a completely dark box and sat exactly where we're sitting now, and poked a tiny aperture hole, that wall, projected over here on this wall, we would see everything going on outside. No lens, no mirrors necessary. It's a natural phenomenon. Light passing through that aperture and hitting a surface will show us an image of what's going on outside. Everything that light is also hitting outside. Trouble with that is, of course, that it would be like a motion picture, right? Because everybody walking by, we would also see there as well. Changes in weather, changes in light, we would see. The oldest account of this apparatus, oh, and we would see it upside down because light passing through an aperture like that reverses. So again, a natural phenomenon. This kind of device, this kind of apparatus and its phenomena was documented as long ago as about 400 BC. China. Still not as old as the cave paintings there, but pretty long ago. So we understood clearly, and have understood for a significant part of our history, how to project an image. What we didn't know how to do was record it. Stop it. How do you fix it? In other words, much more difficult prospect. Nevertheless, this device was used by artists, by painters especially, back, again, this is what's been recorded around the 17th century. Artists like Canaletto, artists like Vermeer used this to aid their painting, right? To create more accurate paintings, because the goal of many painters in those centuries was to get as close as possible to creating a painting that emulated the way our eye sees. That was a good way to do it. I mean, if you've got an image projected on the wall and you can be sure it's going to be static, what can you do? Well, you can put some material up there and you can go trace it, right? Cheating? No, I don't think so. It's a tool, as any other tool. So that's the basis of photography, because what you're looking at here is essentially the structure of a camera. With the use of lenses and mirrors, we can control the way that light bounces around further. But that's the basis of a camera. Smaller. When the gentleman was out here photographing the Jeep, his handheld camera, I was thinking, well, if this was Hill and Adamson, they would have had a camera this big out there. They would have had to, you know, hours mixing chemistry, preparing paper. The camera would have had to have been commissioned to be built. It was a whole different animal in the 1840s than it is now. We'll talk a bit more about that later. So those first fixed images, device like this, when was that? The 19th century. So what happened? Well, 1839, you see the results of decades of experimentation and the introduction of the first fixed photographic images. And I like to think of this in terms of personal context. Like, well, that still seems a long time ago. We've all lived with photography all our lives, yes, in one form or another. Well, my kids don't know what a negative is. We've all lived with photography, but there was a point at which it was very new. People hadn't experienced anything like this before. And so to contextualize this, I like to think of it in terms of my own family history, right? When I was young, I knew my great-grandmother. My great-great-grandfather stands out in my mind because we have a lot of history on, was born in 1847 during Hill and Adamson's partnership, right? Pretty good chance that for a decade, maybe two in his life, he still would not have seen a photograph. They weren't that common. They became much more common very, very quickly. But you know, being born in 1847, he may have been, you know, 10 years old, in his teens, perhaps, depending on where you lived and what your cultural situation was before he ever saw a photograph. And may not have even then had a photograph made of himself because it was an expensive prospect early on as well. So that's an interesting bit of context. There was a time in which it would have been odd to see someone standing out on the street with a camera on a tripod. Not anymore. Right. So this was also a time up until, you know, the late 1840s, 1850s, when photographs were handmade by the photographers and sometimes their assistants. Photographic materials were made or commissioned by the photographers themselves. You couldn't just pop into the shops and buy your kit, right? Photographers had to have a knowledge of chemistry. They had to mix their own chemicals. They didn't hand make their own paper, most of them, but they would buy paper that was made by a specialist. They would have to commission a camera to be built, often to their specifications. Most early photographers, at least in the first decade or so, were of course not trained as professional photographers. They were trained in other skills and adopted photography as part of what they did. Some of them dedicated themselves full on to it, but most didn't come to it naturally. And so that brings us to the first two photographers we'll talk about today, leading up to Hill and Adamson. The first one is Jacques-Louis Landin-Daguerre, France. And on the 7th of January, 1839, his experiments, or the results of his experiments, were presented to the French Academy of Scientists. And this is an example from the Mackinnon collection at the National Galleries of Scotland, the National Library of Scotland. This is a daguerreotype. This is the kind of photograph that he introduced to the world. You may have seen photographs like this. They're often small, to be held in the hand, not much bigger than one of these things. Often protected by glass and presented in a leather case. This case has a cover, but the cover is separated over time. You can find these things fairly easily in antique shops. Not as much now as you used to be able to. But they have some interesting qualities to them. A daguerreotype is a one-of-a-kind image, right? That image was exposed right onto a sheet of silvered copper and then developed. There's no negative for it, right? You could certainly copy a daguerreotype, but it would be very difficult, and you can kind of see why. They're very reflective, very mirror-like in their appearance. And that's my big forehead there. But what you're seeing is that image reflected in the daguerreotype itself, not the glass that sits in front of it. They're very reflective, and you can get a better sense of it even here when you hold it at different angles, and that mirror-like capacity of it really stands out. And on the image on the left, there are points at which it even becomes a negative image. It flips on you. And there are these wonderful, precious little things. Beautiful. But as far as what many people wanted photography to be, not terribly practical. And these were made up into the 1850s, 1860s, and then not so much. There's still professional photographers here and there, professional artists in some cases, who still utilize this process. In fact, something to keep in mind, just as I mentioned right now, is there are a lot of photographic processes that have happened over the past almost 185 years since its introduction in 1839. Almost all of them are still in use by someone somewhere, even these antiquated processes. What happens is the same thing as any science, visual form, art, right? It just becomes harder to get access to the materials for and more expensive. But this is the daguerreotype. Well, upon learning of Daguerre's invention, a man in England named William Henry Fox Talbot presented his own experiments to the Royal Society. What Talbot created, there's a bit of a contrast there to what you see in the daguerreotype. This is a paper print. That's what we came to know as a photograph, yes? Printed image on a piece of paper. But there's more to Talbot's image, just that. Talbot essentially created what became the most enduring photographic process in its history so far, the negative-positive process. I'm showing you a couple of Hill and Adamson images as an example. So essentially what Talbot created was the ability to, instead of putting a piece of silver copper in the back of your camera, put a piece of paper, sensitized by light-sensitive material, light-sensitive chemistry. And that piece of paper recorded a negative image. You could take that negative image, and at the time this was clunkier than what we're familiar with, but it was the best way to do it. You could take that negative image, place it down on another piece of light-sensitive paper, out in full sunlight, and the light passing through that negative image would produce a positive one. So arguably, Talbot's invention is the one that has served photography much better than Daguerre's over its history. That said, there are some aesthetic differences to it. So on the left is a detail from a Daguerreotype, and on the right, a detail from one of Eilean Adamson's calotype paper prints. Now, this I mentioned this term calotype. This is essentially what Talbot called his process, a calotype, or beautiful image. So Talbot wrote of his prints, and you can see a bit of what he's talking about here, that they are, quote, impressed by nature's hand. And when we've learned more by experience respecting the formation of such pictures, they will doubtless be brought much nearer perfection. So what he's in part referring to there is something that you can see as far as the level of detail that's captured, yes? Obviously, you're passing light through a fairly dense piece of paper, and there were ways of making the paper less dense than it would have been otherwise, by waxing it, that sort of thing. You still got an image in which you could pretty readily see the paper fibers, right? Because that liquid chemistry impregnated the paper fibers, and so that was the surface of the paper. And the makeup of the paper was always going to be part of how you were experiencing it. A much softer image in general. The daguerreotype, I don't know if you can see, but the level of detail that you can capture in a daguerreotype is amazing. Even this tiny little photograph, you can see the wrinkles around his eyes. Not even close over here. You can see each individual hair. Now, I should mention that at this time, there was, of course, no science for making a color photograph. That wouldn't happen until the early 20th century. So if you wanted color in your photograph, how'd you have to do it? You had to hand color. So many photographers employed artists, painters, to hand color their photographs. And there are some beautiful ones out there. There are also some that are not so beautiful or well done, but that one's pretty good. Very finely detailed. Right. So, importantly to our story, Talbot was persuaded not to extend the patent for his process into Scotland. What did that allow? It allowed for photographers here to take it on as their own. Right? And he was persuaded by a man named Sir David Brewster of St. Andrews, with whom Talbot had been confiding the results of his photographic experiment for years prior. They had a regular correspondence, they were good friends. Brewster was a physician, mathematician, an astronomer, an inventor, and a writer. He had an interest in optics and light, and is associated with the inventions of the kaleidoscope and the stereoscope. And there he is, in a photograph by Eilean Anderson. Now, among Brewster's associates in St. Andrews were two men that are in this photograph by Eilean Anderson. On the top left is John Adamson, and on the bottom right is Robert Adamson. Now, John is thought to have made the first successful calotype in Scotland. Again, being able to use that process because Talbot did not extend the patent here. And John taught the process to his brother, Robert, on the bottom right. Robert's persistent ill health motivated him to forego a career in engineering in favor of becoming one of the first professional photographers in Scotland and indeed the world. In May of 1843, at Brewster's suggestion, and that's not the last time we're going to hear that term, at Brewster's suggestion, Adamson set up a studio in Rock House on Calton Hill in Edinburgh. Now, keep in mind, in 1843, this is a handful of years after photography was introduced to the world, right? So we're right on the leading edge of it. And while much of the world was still grappling to some extent with the daguerreotype, it was here in Scotland, somebody took Eilean Adamson, if it were, the form that, as I mentioned, has endured so long, and took it to new places very quickly and very powerfully. By contrast, the other member of our party here, David Octavius Hill, was in his 40s in 1843. And so within Adamson's first month in Edinburgh, Brewster introduced Adamson to David Octavius Hill. So there was a 20-year difference in their ages. Adamson was still in his 20s. And again, at the beginning of his professional life, he was also a very subdued character, as I think maybe you get a bit of a sense of in this photograph, as compared to Hill here. By contrast, Hill was an established artist. He was very socially adept, but also very socially persuasive. And we'll talk more about this dynamic between the two shortly. Hill was also a very versatile artist. He was one of the first artists in Britain to engage with lithographic printmaking in the early 1800s. He was very interested in book illustration, and as a painter, he was skilled in both landscapes and portraits. He was secretary of the Royal Scottish Academy, so that is an example of his social reach there. And backing up again for a bit of context, it's important to recognize that at this time, the 1840s, Scotland was energized and getting world attention at this point in the 19th century by vigorous innovation in engineering, medicine, geology, and the arts. Hill was right in there with those circles. And when you add to that the cultural shift that inspired and resulted from the disruption, it's clear that this was a transformative time throughout all of Scottish society. And Hill, as I mentioned, was well integrated into the circles driving these changes, as was our old friend David Brewster. Brewster and Hill were both involved in the schism within the church when on the 18th of May, 1843, 150 ministers walked out of the General Assembly in protest of state intervention in the affairs of the church, and in particular regarding state control over clerical positions. This was all very exciting for many people at that time. And one of the things that Rev Anderson mentioned the other day that really stuck with me was how it gave everyday people a sense of a voice. Right? Because these essentially weren't revolutionaries as we understand revolutionaries who left the church. Right? These were men of standing, essentially, who gave up a tremendous amount in order to do this. And this was an appeal to Hill, who believed that it needed to be celebrated in a painting. And so he was inspired by the events to make what I describe as an ambitious painting, that you see reproductions of there to either side, that would represent each of the declarations with 400 signatories, giving each, and this is important, giving each equal presence in the painting. Now there's some trickiness about that as regards the finished painting itself. We'll talk again about that later. So by early June, at the suggestion of David Brewster, Hill met with Robert Adamson. Following Brewster's suggestion that calotypes might be of benefit in capturing the likenesses of the ministers. But that came only after it and during the time that Hill was approaching the making of the painting, or beginning the making of the painting in the traditional fashion. And that's making preparatory studies for the composition. And this is one such study. So here he's kind of mapped out basic composition. He's not terribly concerned with those individual portraits, but he wants to get a sense of the room. He wants to get a sense of the way the people are existing in that space, and he wants to get a sense, hopefully, of the energy of that moment. And you can kind of feel it in this very rough drawing. There is an energy to it. He also did at that time preparatory paintings for some of the subjects. And these are a few of those. And this is the traditional way of approaching a finished painting. You do the studies first, and then build everything you've learned into that finished work. And so you can imagine Brewster stepping in at this point and saying, whoa, wait a minute, there's another way to do this bit. You're not going to get all those people back in the room as they were, but there's another way to do this, and perhaps the calotype is the way. Brewster wrote to William Henry Fox Talbot at that time, quote, "A grand historical picture is undertaken by a first-rate artist to represent the First General Assembly of the Free Church. I got hold of the artist, showed him the calotype and the eminent advantage he might derive from it in getting likenesses of all the principal characters before they were dispersed to their respective homes. He was at first incredulous, but went to Mr. Adamson and arranged with him preliminaries for getting all the necessary portraits. Now, in a series of lithographed circulars with individual names hand inscribed, Hill invited the ministers to sit for the portraits, stating that he had made the necessary arrangements with Mr. Adamson, a gentleman recommended to him by Sir David Brewster, name dropping, and the subjects were to meet him at Mr. Adamson's house on Carlton Hill during 4 specified days between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., in which, quote, the sitter is detained only a very short time, the whole process being effected in a few minutes. So the invitation gives us a bit of insight into the making of the calotypes. Hill is specifically noting the short commitment of time, presumably given people's familiarity with the much extended duration required of a sitter for a painting. He's hoping that will be some appeal. This duration, I would suggest, is still quite different from what we expect today, as exposure times in front of the camera or it could be up to 3 minutes long. Right? We're used to that. Right? What are we used to now? We're used to somebody taking 1,200 images on this, dumping them all on Facebook and expecting us to look at every one of them, all split-second photographs. Whole different thing. So to back up again, because we're getting a little bit into the photographic process there. It's interesting to note that before that exposure could even be made, high quality writing paper was treated with silver nitrate and potassium iodide solution. For best results, the paper was exposed in the camera when freshly prepared. The longer it sat around, more unpredictable results. Full sunlight was required for the shortest exposure time. So that's up to 3 minutes in full sunlight. And also it was necessary for the best range of, best tonal range from dark shadows to bright highlights. Because of this, interestingly, Hill and Adamson's output was seasonal right? This is Scotland. Not counting today. This was much more possible in the summer in general. In Edinburgh, really try to contend with the wind as much as anything. The exposure again produces a negative image, and after developing and fixing is then contact printed, as I showed you, on another sheet of sensitized paper, again in full sunlight. The process was inexact, and that was due to any number and combination of variables in chemistry, what was in the water, in terms of mineral content especially, the qualities of the paper itself, right? It wasn't possible to, it's still not possible to create a completely consistent batch of paper. The light, of course, the quality of the light, and the subject. In many of Hill and Adamson's photographs, subjects are moving. What happens when you move in a photograph that's exposed for that long? What do you get in the photograph? Blur, right? And if the exposure is long enough and the movement fast enough, the image could be outright ghostly or not visible at all. Nevertheless, Robert Adamson's skill and consistency with the prints made him, as Hill described, quote, the most successful manipulator the art has yet seen. And his steady industry and knowledge of chemistry is such that both from him and his brother, John Adamson, who I mentioned earlier, much new improvements may yet be expected. So think back to that Talbot quote, where he was suggesting that improvements could be made. This is Hill making the mark and saying, that's us, and that's Robert Adamson. That's what we're doing. We are those people. And here lies, I think, the magic of Hill and Adamson's partnership. Adamson's technical virtuosity sang in perfect harmony with Hill's artistic vision. The partnership was surely more dynamic than just that. And as scholar Sarah Stevenson argues, quote, it is likely they found each other's company stimulating, that Hill's enthusiasm and organizing ability galvanized Adamson into greater activity, and that Adamson's skill excited D.O. Hill into more visual experimentation. Meaning, the partnership extended, didn't just benefit from, but extended the abilities of both men. It was a true collaboration in that sense. Further, Stevenson offers that in the hands of most photographers, the calotype was conceived first as a mechanical and chemical process and then turned into a work of art by manipulation of the print. In contrast, Hill, in collaboration with Adamson, was organizing the photographs as works of art before they were taken, with only practical touch-ups after the fact. Sometimes, if you're gonna have to sit for a couple of minutes, you often need something to hold your head still, right? And so there were these braces that were created to hold the head still. Often those braces would be visible, at least in part, in the photograph. And so on that paper negative, you could sort of paint it out so that it wouldn't be visible in the positive print. So that's what I meant by sort of practical manipulation, is they would do that sort of thing. Right. Hill understood this quality, and despite his initial incredulity, within a month of meeting Adamson, had become entranced by the possibilities offered by the calotype. So much so that the duo rounded out 1843 by extending their subjects beyond studies for the disruption picture to include personalities within Hill's social and intellectual circles. And just for contrast, giving a few examples of the calotype portraits they made for the disruption picture. We'll come back to these. This just gives you a sense. Looking at right out of the gate there in 1843. But as I said, within that first month, everything changed. Hill saw the creative potential behind this. And so they started making photographs of Hill's social and intellectual circles. Here's an example here. Hugh Miller, the geologist, groundbreaking geologist. New Haven fishing community, just north of Edinburgh, which they made about 130 photographs. Just began with those in 1843. And geographic sites, primarily around Edinburgh, some in St. Andrews, a few other places, but this is a particularly interesting one. The Scott Monument, under construction. Pretty interesting. Doesn't look much like that anymore, but you can get a sense of the fact that they're not just, even at this time, early on in their relationship, they're not just depicting the subject in their photographs. They're not just describing. They're not just capturing facts. They're making photographs that had the potential to be suggestive of something beyond the specifics of the photograph itself. It wasn't just a document, right? You know, with some of their circle, they wanted to provide suggestions of what that person was about, what that person did as a profession, what their skills were, what they were offering up to the world. So often you see the sort of accoutrement of their profession and their interests, their own personal interests as well. And you get a sense too sometimes of confidence in this case. With the New Haven community, there was a sense in the making of these photographs that, keeping in mind, we're in the throes, the height of the Industrial Revolution here. Cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow were not always pleasant places to be. Dirty, there was sooty, there was crime, there was poverty, and communities even close to home for Hill and Adamson, like New Haven, presented an alternative, in a sense, a more idealized kind of lifestyle, closer, in a sense, to the work itself, closer to the earth, closer to the sea, in this case. And of course, no one would have been able to look at that time, something like the Scott Monument, and linger too long on the specifics of that, because they were thinking about Scott. They were thinking about what they knew of his writings. They were thinking about his very, very lively legacy at that point. And so this was much more than just a depiction. Hill came to believe that the calotype we see here was a visual form with the capacity for great beauty, stating, quote, "The rough and unequal texture throughout the paper is the main cause of the calotype failing in details before the daguerreotype." And this is the real point. And that is the very life of it. That's where the title for this talk comes from. The very life of it. And he continued. They look like the imperfect work of man, not the much diminished work of God. It's a bit of a burn right there to the daguerreotype, because he's essentially saying it's aspiring to not too much, but it's aspiring in the wrong direction. Right? It's trying to mimic, trying to emulate God. But this is something entirely different. Imperfect work of man, very life of it. So after they resumed work in early 1844, they broke for the winter. Hill moved into Rock House, working closer association with Adams. Between 1843 and mid-1846, Hill and Anderson made more than 3,000 known images. Their work slowed in 1846 to 47 as Robert Adamson's health continued to deteriorate. And in December of 1847, he returned to St. Andrews and then died on 14th of January, 1848, at the young age of 26, tuberculosis. Hill continued his interest in photography, promoting the photographs he made under the partnership, and used some as reference material for various paintings that he made thereafter, but made very few photographs of his own after Adamson died. And that brings us back. Though most of the studies for the disruption picture were made in 1843, Hill did not complete the painting until 1866, 2 decades. He sold it to the Free Church for about £1,500 instead of the £3,000 he intended. And so what do we see after the passage of 2 decades? Well, the finished painting appeared intellectual, I think is a good way to describe it. Somewhat awkward in places, perhaps. And I think this had the effect of leaving the individual photographs as sometimes feeling more expressive. And here's a photograph of Thomas Chalmers and the bit of the painting which he's depicted. It's an interesting comparison. He's not just reversed the view, right? But part of it's the different context he's in the painting. He's singled out in the photograph itself. But what a photograph. It feels like a force to be reckoned with in the photograph, where this is sort of much more matter of fact. And we'll look at a few more. John Brown, there he is in the center. And sometimes it's hard to pick individuals out from all the surrounding heads. And then the photograph is based on, although that's a later print of the photograph, that's why it looks a little different. You can see Thomas Blizzard Bell, again, right in the center. I've tried to center them up in these details. And the Hill and Adamson photographs I'm showing you are all from the Mackinnon collection. Reverend John Longyear. It's actually really good likeness he captured there. And there are varying degrees to which he accurately captures the individuals. The painting, I'd say overall, appears dictated perhaps by Hill's desire to accurately translate the individual portraits rather than to place us, the viewer, in the painting via the dynamics of composition, light, color, and think back to the sketch drawing, how much more energy that had. And I think it's important at this point to recall that this painting was meant to commemorate the event from 1843. It wasn't meant to be a historical document. Jimmy Miller, what a fantastic photograph. And there he is. Hill doesn't capture him entirely, but he's one of the few children in the image. Great photograph. One of the group portraits that would have been made in preparation. There's even, sense more energy here than the groups in the painting. One critic compared the heads in the painting to rows of potatoes at the time. Maybe you get a better sense of that there. I think contributing to the painting's uncomfortable, perhaps, appearance is the fact that the subjects are represented across 20 years of time. Some are represented as they looked in the 1840s, and some as they appeared in the 1860s. General one. And there's another quality to it that has been described as having the appearance of a photo montage. Now, this was a popular thing in the mid-19th century, where if you couldn't get a group of people together, you montaged photographs of each of the people together. And so the way you did that was you obtained all the photographs, right? You pasted them down and or placed them down in sort of collage fashion and re-photographed the whole thing. Maybe negative of the whole thing, and then printed from that. And so you would have these groups of people where sometimes it was meant to look like as close as possible. That's just a detail in the previous one, an actual gathering. So there's varying degrees of quality in which this was done. This is photographed by Thomas Annan, who we'll talk about more in a moment. But back again to this notion of some of the sitters being depicted as they looked in the 1840s and some as they looked in the 1860s. Here's a good example. In the Hill and Adamson photograph on the left there, the left-hand individual is Sir James Young Simpson. If that name rings a bell, if you've ever been put under during surgery, you can partially, anyway, thank him. Simpson discovered the anesthetic properties of chloroform, in Edinburgh, just down the road from where I work every day at the portrait gallery. And there he is in Hill and Adamson's photograph from 1843, or sometime between 1843 and 1847. Here he is in the center, looking a little different, yes? That's how he looked about 1860. Well, this is a photograph, and this I'll just say provides some material for future research. This is a photograph by John Moffat, an Edinburgh photographer who Hill would have been very aware of. I mean, look at that. That seems to me pretty clear that at least it's likely that that's the photograph that this portrait by Hill was based on, not one of his own. Possible, anyway. Possible. Just throwing it out there again for future inquiry. But that's I think a good example. And so why would he do this? Well, it's been suggested that part of the reason anyway, or at least part of the effect might be to show, right, that this event that happened at a particular place at a particular time ripples through history. And so it wouldn't have been thinking of it that way terribly important to him for all of the figures in the painting to appear as they did in the 1840s. Right? This suggests a continuance of the importance of this event. What about some of the figures in here? That's Hill himself. They're in the middle, the upper middle, right? But again, photographed by another photographer, James Quintonny, in this instance, another Edinburgh-based photographer. And Hill looked quite a bit younger than that in the 1840s. This would have been, I think, around 1850s. And then, perhaps, not just to commemorate, but memorialize his dear friend, with whom these photographs would not have been made, Robert Adamson, from the family portrait. This is just a detail I pulled from that family portrait, but there it is. Pretty astounding, yes? Pretty powerful, really. Adamson was not at the event. He was not present, as far as anyone knows. But there he is, with his camera. Yes? Fantastic. Now, he wouldn't have been able to make a successful photograph at that event had he been there, again, because of exposure times being so long, and the event was indoors, out in bright sunlight. But when we ask why the camera might be there, it's again because by the 1860s, you couldn't make a split-second photograph quite yet. That wouldn't be until the 1870s. Photographic technology was advancing really quickly, but you could make a successful photograph that only took a few seconds exposure. So there he is for all time. So what's the legacy? Well, Hill originally intended to make engravings based on the painting, but by 1866, photographic technology had advanced to a point in which he commissioned photographer Thomas Annan, where we saw him a few moments ago with the montage, to produce album prints, which you see here in carbon prints of the painting for wide distribution. Not everybody would have been able to see the painting itself. So this was a good way to get the image out there to a much wider public. So what about this guy, Annan? Directly influenced by Hill and Adamson. He knew David Octavius Hill. Annan and his family lived in Rock House for a time after Hill died. So they were quite familiar with him. Annan created immensely important portraits like the one here, Livingston. But perhaps his most significant body of work is a group of images he made of the streets and closes of old Glasgow. And this is one of them. And they were made essentially to document these tenements before they were torn down. These were impoverished buildings. There was social restoration going on here. And so Annan went in to photograph probably initially the architecture of these spaces, but he chose to include the residents. Not sure exactly why, but it is a choice to include the residents of these often dark spaces. And part of the reason had to have been to give them a face, to show us who occupied these places, who was, and maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but who was going to be displaced, because that's what happens, isn't it, when these buildings were torn down. The effect, though, is that in terms of the history of photography, this is some of the earliest social documentary photography. Again, made right here in Scotland. The Annan family became tremendously important into the early 20th century. James Craig Annan promoted Hill and Adamson's work to another internationally known photographer in New York, Alfred Stieglitz, who published this volume, this series of volumes called Camera Work. In the early 20th century, in 2 volumes, he included, at Annan's behest, Hill and Adamson's photograph in a form, photogravure, that was much more easily reproducible. You could also manipulate the photographs in photogravure. But remember the negative image I showed you before. This is that image carrying on into wide distribution into the early 20th century. And one of the things that having these collections at the National Galleries and the National Library allows us to do is look at ways in which visual media advanced and evolved over time, from the very cumbersome nature of the calotype photographs on the left to a carbon print from the 1870s, much more reproducible. And the Annans, Thomas Annan, obtained the patent for that in Scotland, so that it could be used here, and then photogravures. And you can see subtle differences in the images as well. And then later into the 20th century, Paul Strand, who created a body of work in South Uist, and here too from the gallery's collection, Peggy and Archie MacDonald. And he directly referenced Eilean Anderson, saying that he was inspired by the inner strength that they recorded in their photographs, and this clearly carries through into his photographs from the Western Isles. You can see both Eilean Anderson's work and Paul Strand's in a current exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery called Counted, and it's based upon the census. It's open through the 25th of September. Specific photographs I've shown you are in there, but hopefully that just gives you a bit of inspiration to go explore for yourself. You can see both Eilean Anderson included in there, Paul Strand, along with other historical photographers as well as more contemporary ones. So you can see in person the sort of ripples through time that these photographs have created, that in a sense, thinking back, wouldn't have happened without the disruption bringing those two, a scientist and an artist, Eilean Anderson, together. It also gives us the opportunity within the Mackinnon collection itself, and now jumping to some things that we can actually just walk right through there and see, to do a bit of compare and contrast. So here are the New Haven fishwives from the early 1840s, and we can compare that with an image of fishwives from a century later, 1937, and what a difference. Prior to this, prior to the introduction of trams, the fishwives would have to walk the catch up the hill from New Haven into Edinburgh to sell daily. But with the invention of trams, and that's the whole idea here, that process was eased perhaps just a bit. This one is a press photograph called The Day's Work Begins. I'm guessing their day began a whole lot earlier than what is depicted in the photograph. Maybe it just began for the porter there. And then, what happened? So, long story short, within 15 years, if that, of Eilean Anderson's work, you could create the most super sharp, accurate photograph possible, much sharper than anything we can get with one of these so far. Photographs came to offering in very short order something much more akin to what our eye sees, right? But by the early 20th century, we started to get photographs like this. Again, it's almost as if it regressed. That's not it, really. What happened was, with the advancement of photographic technology, shorter exposure times, sharper images, the ability in the 1880s for anyone to go purchase a handheld camera at the local chemist, shoot off a roll of film, send it back, have that film developed, have prints made, have the camera come back to you, load it up with another roll of film. Professional photographers by that point were saying, whoa, wait a minute, hang on. Everybody can do this now, but everybody can't do this now. This isn't a solely mechanical medium, right? It can be manipulated, it can be used for the purposes of art. So they sought ways in the late 19th, early 20th century to further manipulate the photograph, essentially bringing it all back to what Hill and Anderson had offered in the 1840s, right? Creating photographs that we could describe as perhaps much more painterly, photographs that suggest rather than depict, right? That tap our emotions, tap our memories, tap our aspirations. And this is a great example, John Simpson's Untitled photograph from 1935. Young child, perhaps an early teen in the forest looking into a mirror that's strangely attached to a tree, but it's reflective, right, in the most general sense, yes? It inspires not just our engagement with the details of the scene, but with our own memories of youth, archetypes even of youth. And then we finish with this one. Again, we can go look at it shortly. John D. Stevens' Dawn of Light and Liberty, a photograph that, yes, taken in an identifiable place, in an identifiable time, but not about that really at all. At this point, photographers were very readily giving suggestive titles to their works. It wasn't just about the subject. This one's called The Dawn of Light and Liberty. So the title automatically starts conjuring up our own associations with those terms and our own histories, right? And in this case, we're talking about something that looks to history. It looks to the future simultaneously. It looks to a kind of emotional response. It uses color before color was available against a hand-colored photograph, to emotional effect. Got all the ingredients that we expect, not so much from a photograph, but from an effective work of art. Whatever that work of art is, whether it's a painting, drawing, photograph, a film, it's all there by the early 20th century. I think we can owe a lot of that to Hill and Anderson. So that's us. Thank you.